Okay, so we've been through the story of the valuer getting the initial valuation, agreeing terms and conditions of engagement, having that perhaps short period of time to produce the initial valuation report. That's happened, and we're now a few months down the line. Jim, or a building surveyor, has produced his initial report. My lovely waterside development that I probably looked up some BCIS figures for, I didn't take into account the fact that, although it looked pretty obvious from the picture, that the site was contaminated. It was an old coal yard wharf, so there's some remediation costs. Perhaps needed some deep piled foundations, some special costs that I hadn't allowed for. And Jim's assessment, or the building surveyor's assessment of build costs, is up to 1.955 million. There's been a slight adjustment in the GDV. Had I really reflected the value of the flats with no view over the water at the back? Possibly not. Market's hardened a little bit. But the overall effect is the residual land value is slashed down to £975,000 from the previously reported figure. Now, some time's gone by, but I've brushed down my valuation and I'm probably feeling a little bit nervous. So I wonder if there's a problem with this. So Charlie's going to have a little talk about margin of errors and how we could or could not be negligent in this scenario.
Okay. So do we have a problem? We had a residual land value of 1.75. On the revised figures, it's dropped to 975. We've got increased costs. I suppose probably what Paul hasn't talked about is we've got a scenario where perhaps the developer has gone under, development stopped. Is there someone here to blame? And this is where I suppose, sadly, my profession come in. I ought to stress, it's not me, I just defend surveyors. But we do see a lot of claimant lawyers will come in, will pick through this, and then come to a view as to whether perhaps there was an overvaluation and the lending shouldn't have taken place in the first place. So for negligence to be established, what the courts look at is did the valuer exercise reasonable skill and care when coming to his or her valuation as at that original date. Courts have been very quick to make it clear that valuation is an art and not a science. So what does that mean? Basically it means that a number of different valuers can value a particular property, a particular development, come up with a variety of valuations, and a number of those can be true, a number of those can be correct, they're non-negligent. What the courts or what the law established is that there is a permissible margin either side of a notional true valuation. So effectively we have a bracket. So we have a non-negligent bracket where if a valuation is within that bracket, it's non-negligent. Now that bracket moves according to the state of the market, the type of the property, if it's a particularly difficult property, if there are no comparables, if the market is a tricky market, if perhaps we're looking at a residual valuation where actually we're all aware that it is open to the end product, the end valuation changing considerably depending upon the inputs that go in. The leading authority is, this case, Lincoln and CB Richard Ellis Hotels, where the judge basically put in place sort of three brackets, plus or minus 5% for a standard residential property. We would suggest a sort of a 2 up, 2 down, a flat, provided there's nothing unusual, nothing unique there. 10% for a more unusual property, and then up to 15% or even higher for something exceptional. We'll see a lot of discussion between valuers as to what is the appropriate margin of error, and the lawyers will get very hot under the Connor, about this. I mean, interestingly, there was a piece of research done 5 or 6 years ago which suggested that actually, on average, experts are about 22% apart. So who needs the courts? Going back to Paul's residual calculation, clearly we've got a jump from 1.75 million down to 975,000. That valuation is in the negligent bracket. So what I'm going to do now is just follow through this scenario, look at the implications of this from both the risk perspective, and then I'll have a quick look at the possible claim as well. So what the courts, if this went down that route, would end up doing, the judge would hear evidence from 2 expert valuers. The judge would then come to his or her own view as to what they think the true value was, would then apply a margin of error to it. If the valuation is outside that range, then the lender in this case would be over the first hurdle. The burden would then move to the surveyor to demonstrate that the valuation was nevertheless carried out with correct level of skill, care and diligence. And common sense dictates if you've got a valuation that is very wrong, that's outside of a margin of error, there's a big hill for that valuer to climb. It's not going to be that easy to demonstrate that they've come up with the wrong valuation, but notwithstanding that, it's non-negligent. Turning that on its head, it's probably the only area that I'm aware of where a professional can make an absolute horlicks of their advice, get all the inputs wrong, all the comparables wrong, but come out with an end figure. If that end figure is within an acceptable margin of error, it's non-negligent. Moving from that, just very quickly to risk management. Again, it ought to be common sense, but why is effective risk management important? I always like this quote. Why do you have brakes on a car? So you can go faster. Why do you have a good risk management policy? So you can pursue your business goals more energetically. Now, you don't need to have been on the wrong end of many PI claims to know how important risk management is. Not only can it affect your bottom line with increased payments on excesses, affects your premium, it can break a business. We've seen a number of businesses sadly disappear in the last few years on the back of claims, on the back of risk management related issues. So one of the messages I suppose I'm keen to push today is this issue of risk and reward. And it's one thing that I spend a lot of time talking about, that a lot of professionals, we're all very, clearly we want new instructions, we want new work, but we don't stop and look at the cost, look at the balance between risk and reward. What are we charging for that piece of advice we're giving? What are the potential liabilities that we're taking on? I've had a lot of cases over the last 10, 15 years where you look at the fee that was charged and then you look at the damages that ultimately were paid. I've seen a number of reports that were purely, let's just say, evaluation report, a rewrite, a top and tail, no fee charged, with a multi-million-pound claim following. To look at the other end of the scale, there was a case called Paratus at the very beginning of the last cycle. It was a claim for £40,000 damages. The valuation fee, £37. So again, balance out that risk and reward. Staying with the same theme, PI claims. Cost of a PI claim can be very large. That's not just legal fees, but expert fees. Then there are a whole host of hidden costs. If you've got to be working with your defence team, putting together a defence to a claim, you can't be out there winning new business, working with existing clients. So there's a knock-on effect on loss of profit. Talked already about increased excesses, increased premiums, damage to reputation, lost clients. the other thing which a lot of people don't realise until they are facing a PI claim is actually stress. You know, no one likes to be criticised, even more so to be criticised professionally. So I suppose what I'm saying is actually everything we can do to improve our risk management and minimise the possibility of facing a claim should be done. So going back to this claim scenario, the scenario that no one in the room, no one wants to be faced with this. You know, the lender who's lost money, the developer who's gone under, the surveyor who's facing a PI claim. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the claim process and what is likely to happen for those who've never been through this. So if a mistake is made, negligence is established, the court's approach is to put the lender in this case back into the scenario, back into the position he should have been but for the negligence. So the valuation surveyor is responsible only for the loss for which they'd assumed responsibility to the lender, and that's around the adequacy of the security. They're not responsible for all the other lenders' losses. So we saw a lot of claims on the back of 07, 08, Northern Rock, Lehman Brothers, market crashed, and suddenly a whole load of valuers were facing, you know, enormous losses, enormous claims, but a lot of those losses were caused by the drop in the market. The law is clear that the valuer is not responsible for that. The valuer is only responsible for the loss that they had assumed responsibility for. So, i.e. the bit between the negligent valuation and the non-negligent valuation. And we call this the Samco cap after this case here. So looking at losses, the court wants to put the lender back into the position that they would or should have been in. Two approaches. They look at the Samco loss, which is this capped loss, this damages between the non-negligent and the negligent valuation, and then they look at the lender's actual financial loss, which sometimes can be markedly more than the capped loss. And this will be where, if you've ever been in this scenario, you'll then find that your lawyers will start to talk about lending evidence, and let's have a look at what steps were taken by the bank. Were they contributory negligent in lending to perhaps the wrong borrower? Did they carry out all the steps, or some of the steps that Jim talked about earlier on about looking at the actual development? Did they mitigate their loss? Did they sell the property at the right time? Did they take steps to ensure the property didn't deteriorate? We see a lot of issues around that. So that's probably the main armoury in the surveyors, or that's available to the surveyor when facing a PI claim. And reductions for a mitigation or contributory negligence can be anywhere in the region of 30 to 70%. So it does have a considerable effect on the loss. So taking this one step forward, looking at just likely resolution scenarios, expert evidence. Undoubtedly, both sides will need expert evidence to give a view as to what the correct valuation or value of the property was. Using that, there'll be a risk analysis done by the claimant's solicitor, by the surveyor's solicitor, and there'll be a number of different scenarios that they can enter into. The typical one would be around without prejudice negotiations. So solicitors get together, either on the phone or in a room, have a conversation around risk, trying to thrash out some form of settlement sum. Mediation is something that is extremely popular. A mediation, basically the two parties get together with a third party, a facilitator, a mediator, and the mediator's job is to build trust with the two parties, but also to test their cases, test their evidence, and really put them through the ringer. A bit like, the suggestion being, if you don't settle this now and you do go to court, these are the sort of questions you're going to be asked. So it's a bit of a wake-up call for both sides. It is also done at an early stage in the matter when legal costs shouldn't be anywhere near what they will ultimately be at trial. So it's aimed at trying to reduce costs, risk, and try to resolve matters at an early stage. There was a time where huge amounts of claims were settled at mediation. Less so now. And I think everyone goes into a mediation expecting there to be a settlement. I must admit, the last 4 or 5 I've done, half have settled, half haven't. They may then settle in the months after the mediation, but what it means is it gives you the sort of the catalyst to get a better understanding of what the other side's case is. They understand your case. You've got a better idea of strengths and weaknesses. Adjudication is something that we are seeing more of in the PI side. It was something that was brought in originally just to look at costs in relation to construction projects. It's a very quick process. As you saw, I should have said, in relation to mediation, your mediator will not form a view. So your mediator is not a judge. The mediator will not turn around and say, well, actually, you're wrong or you're right. What he will do is encourage and draw your attention to the risks. An adjudicator, however, will. So adjudicator will produce an opinion, and it's a much quicker process. Finally, litigation. So this is the typical way of pleadings, disclosure of relevant documents, witness evidence, expert evidence, and then everyone goes to court. It's a very drawn-out process. The courts are very busy at the moment. It can take a long time to get to trial. So actually, there's very much a push to avoid litigation, if at all possible. Some things you can't. They've got to go down that route. And then also we see claims withdrawn as well if there's if there's a good defence there. Now I'm just going to look at some of the common problems that we see, the mistakes that get made that turn themselves into PI claims. To talk about them, hopefully with a view to you not making the same sort of mistakes. A lot of the things I'll talk about they're not particularly technical. We may focus on sort of project management and then move on to valuation, but actually the underlying issues, the underlying mistakes actually are common whether we're talking about a surveyor, an accountant, a solicitor. These are the sort of mistakes that we see regularly. So here, clarity of reporting is a big issue, where you will find lawyers like to pick holes in grey areas. If a report could be, or a methodology could be explained more clearly, if often when looking at, and I'll come back to build costs, but for example, evaluation methodology, you'll have a report, you'll have comparables, and you'll have evaluation. The bit that the lawyers would love, I would love it on the basis of defending a valuer, is something that shows what analysis has been carried out using those comps to get from a better comp to this particular property and why you put this value on it. And rarely ever do I find, maybe I'm asking for the impossible, but if I had that sort of document, it's the sort of thing that, we're all approaching these problems with hindsight, but something like that that's on the file, doesn't have to be a great big lengthy document, but just some scribbles, would knock on the head a lot of these issues. Even better if that analysis is actually in the report, so that the reader can read, they can understand how they've got from A to E.
Would you be opening yourself up to a little bit more potential criticism if you did that? So, well, this is a better comparable than that. Wouldn't a solicitor potentially turn around and say, well, actually, why do you say that? Because we think this one's better than that one.
I suppose there's two ways to look at it. If you did that at the outset, and it was picked up then, before the report was relied on and anything lent on it, and let's just say there is a mistake in there and actually you've got the wrong comparable, you can correct it before it's relied on, so there's no reliance, there's no loss. So actually there's never going to be a PI claim. Later down the line, I can see where you're coming from.
Like a rope to hang.
Yeah, no, exactly. Your whole file becomes disclosable in a PI claim in any event. So if it's in the report, or sorry, if it's in the file but not in the report, it's going to get disclosed. But if you can't, and a lot of these times you're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years on, very hard. I can't remember that particular, development. I can't remember what I would probably have done this, and that's where a court will turn around and say, actually, you're the professional. You should have a record. If you haven't got a record, I'm going to criticise you because you just don't really know. So they place massive weight on contemporaneous evidence. So actually, it's a bit like I'm jumping ahead, but you give advice, difficult advice on the phone to a client, and often we'll find you might be out on site, you're giving advice that you're not wholly comfortable with, but it's advice that they're asking you to step off the fence. That's your role. That's what you do. If you noted it down, I advised them that these were the risks, blah 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 blah, and there was a problem flowing from it, you're in a much stronger position to be able to go back because you've got something on your file. They will remember the advice. They may not have actually understood or taken on board everything you've said, which is often where we see the problems. They only listen to what they want to hear. But if you've given both sides of the equation, then you've got a greater chance to say, well, actually, this is what I had a case a long time ago where it was a classic lender's case. There was an issue that the valuer had overvalued, and we asked for the file, and in there were a number of telephone attendance notes. We couldn't read them, so we sent the file back and said, look, can you tell me what this says? Can you send us a typed version? But there were 3 calls from the person at the bank phoning the valuer saying, thanks for your valuation, could you increase it? If we can't increase it, the deal's just not going to happen. Go away, have another look. Ideally, what the valuer should have done was to say, no, this is my view, end of. He went away, had another look, sent in another report. Actually, I can increase it, a little bit. Did so. Next thing on the file was another attendance note. It's not enough. He increased it again. Now, my advice is don't, unless you're comfortable with, that you've got it wrong first time. You stick to what you say the true value is. But anyway, he increased it, but we had an attendance note. So when the claim came in, we wrote to the claimant's solicitors and said, thanks very much, we know what you do. Have a little look at both of these reports. Have a look at the discussion that took place. We never heard of anything further. So one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later on around risk and reward is purely around that making notes of those difficult, the times we give difficult advice, so you've got a record, because you're all busy, you're advising in relation to numerous different properties at any one time. You're not going to remember exactly the advice you gave. Your client, especially a lay client, it's their one. It's more important to them. They will note that down. They will remember it, and the courts will place a greater onus on you to have a record. We see lots of claims in relation to development projects where the build costs are wrong. They're incorrect, and whether it's as Jim puts it, it's the developer undercooking, believing that actually they can build this for less than they can. Whether it is the cynic in me saying, well, actually, that's what we see sometimes, they've got a number of ongoing projects. If I can get those build costs as low as possible, I can borrow as much as I can. I may not spend it all on this one development, I may spend it somewhere else, but actually I can borrow as much as possible. Problem is, it's the valuer who's relied on those build costs. If they haven't analysed those build costs, it renders, as it did here, that valuation advice negligent. So when it comes to build costs, if you've got the ability, the expertise to analyse them, agree that with the client, and that's what you do. If you don't, then you need to make it very clear and get the agreement of the lender that actually I haven't analysed these build costs. I strongly recommend you do. Would you like me to go, and bear in mind a lot of time you're under a very tight time frame, would you like me to go ahead and value on the basis of the assumption that you're happy with these figures, that you will go away and check them. And it just puts the onus back onto or away from your own PI insurance in the event those build costs are not right. And we do see, there are scenarios where, to be fair, certain developers can do things more cost effectively than others. But the problem is if they go under and another developer has to step in who can't do things as cost effectively, then those costs are going to rise. So that's probably the big area where we see problems when it comes to negligence claims in relation to project development. Floor areas. Normally a valuer will be expected to take their own measurements. Make sure you are clear whether it's gross internal, gross external. If you've not carried out the measurements and you're relying on somebody else, make sure you get the agreement of the client, the agreement of the bank in this case, to you relying on them. Again, we see lots of issues with floor areas where there's a mistake in there, but it's in the report in black and white and there's no coming back from it. Planning, again, be clear as to where the information you're relying on has come from. We've seen, regularly see claims in relation to planning issues where the valuer might be supplied with a planning permission and it may not be the latest one, but no check was carried out on the portal, and it may be a planning permission that is less onerous. So again, it has a massive effect on the development. And we've seen, I had one where something was valued. It was a refuse. It was a farm that had planning permission to be converted into a tip, a refuse, a recycling site, and it was valued on that basis. Obviously, massive uplift. There was no planning permission at all, but the surveyor never went and actually checked. So again, these are all, they sound like very sort of silly mistakes, but they all get made, unfortunately. So again, that's something, check planning. Comps, just again, sometimes I'm sure you will all receive, you'll be past, this is a good comparable, and actually sitting there looking at it thinking, well, this is not a good comparable. It's the just not accepting what you're given by colleagues, or agents, stepping back, looking at that comparable, and then carrying out that analysis, either ruling it out or reducing your valuation as a result or increasing it. And then assumptions. Any assumptions you have to make sure they're clear. Make sure it's clear in your report what steps you have taken, what assumptions you have made in relation to evidence that you've been provided with. I've probably touched on a number of these. The over-influence one I think I've done to death. Compliance with instructions and scope of duty. Your instructions, as Jim talked about, define the scope of your duty. Often you'll find that an instruction may morph into something else, and then 6, 7, 8 years later when a claim comes in, no one's really too sure quite what it was you were asked to do. Remember what I was asked to do at the beginning, but not when it changed into this or changed into that. If you have, if your instructions change, write and confirm to the client what those instructions are. Because God forbid there's ever a problem, they're not going to criticise you for writing to confirm what you've been asked to do, but it just helps you and helps them work out what it is you're asked to do, but also what it is you weren't asked to do. So you're able to say, well, actually, if the claims come in, I was never asked to cover that. But if you've got nothing in writing, it's again another grey area, something else for the lawyers to exploit. By way of example, I had a claim where a valuer was asked to value a hotel and leisure complex. Instead of just doing the valuation as asked, they provided some pretty significant advice on the viability of the business. Completely different, and they got it wrong. And there was a claim, and there was a big cheque had to be written. So again, stick to what you've been asked to do. Planning, I think I've touched on enough. Follow-up advice. Often, the original advice in the report, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's been well thought through, well researched. It's when 3 months later, an email comes in, oh, this has changed. Does it affect the advice you gave 3-4 months ago? The number of times that we look at that email trail and the request comes in and then the response, the advice goes out sometimes within a matter of minutes. You think, well, hold on, you couldn't have even opened the email, let alone dug up the original advice, had a look at it. You've just gone back and said, no effect. And often it is, it's that follow-up advice that we get wrong that opens up this can of worms. So making sure that, and again, I appreciate, rarely is there a fee charge for that follow-up advice. If there's a possibility to do it, or it involves you going back and having to go through everything again, that's the conversation you should be having with your client, because you're giving them a fresh piece of advice. And then finally, same thing, flagging what information you do or do not have when producing your valuation. Okay, this is an example of a claim we had a few years ago. It just demonstrates an easy trap that we can all fall into and do of trying to be too helpful. Development valuation. These build costs have been adopted within our appraisal. However, we recommend the bank instructs an independent QS to verify the costs and assumptions prior to releasing the loan facility. If these are deemed incorrect, our opinions of value may be affected. Great, really good piece of advice, really sensible. It puts the onus right back on the bank. What are they then going to say below that? Based on our experience, we consider the build costs adopted are appropriate. They weren't. So the valuation was affected by those build costs. It would have. It's that classic bit where we all want to be as helpful as we possibly can on too many occasions. And there's nothing wrong with that first paragraph at all. If you don't know, it's not your fault. It's going that extra little bit where you don't know, you haven't got the underlying facts to cross-check. Other problems around monitoring. It's a less litigious area, but we do see some issues. There have been a few cases over the last couple of years where project monitor hasn't stepped back and looked at exactly what it was that they were certifying. Jim talked about the certification for the release of further drawdowns, say on a monthly basis, where the value has done it based on works carried out to the site, but the lender wants it on the actual value of the site. And as you'll all know, there'll be times where there'll be works carried out, the value of the site will drop before it climbs. If you get that wrong, and there's a problem with the developer in that intervening period, your advice is wrong. The importance of engaging or recommending to the bank that they engage a QS or a third-party cost controller, and that's something that you don't take that responsibility on if that's not what you engage to do. So it's back to that scope of duty, making it clear that everybody understands what your role is in this and sticking to it. Same with the third point, acting as a QS if you're not there, if you've only been appointed as a contract administrator, and just being aware. Some contracts regularly provide for for payments to be withheld in certain circumstances, making sure that you're aware of what's in that contract and not releasing payments if you shouldn't. Now we're going to draw everything we've all talked about into 4 slides. I think it's 4 slides around top tips. So our sort of suggestions for the sort of takeaways, I suppose, from today. So Paul.
Okay, you might note a bit of repetition in these tips, and we thought, shall we take this out? We thought no, because they're ideas that we all came up with independently. So if you see anything repeated, it's a top tip. Over-influenced by borrower, broker, lender. We've covered that one again today. In the past, I'll put my hand up, has it happened? Probably yes. A case that Charlie mentioned made me remember a case that I was involved in where I was asked to try and up the VP value on an investment property, given that it was a blue chip covenant. Well, 2 months later, Lehman Brothers went bust, and they were a major supplier of Lehman Brothers, and they went bust. And I must admit, I did sweat and worry for a few months about that one. Accepting build costs without detailed analysis. We've covered that to death. Compliance with instructions, scope of duty. Again, you've heard that today, but it's worth remembering about. Building in all costs into your residual. I don't think CIL Section 106 costs. They can be significant and a real cost to the developer that should be reflected in a residual appraisal if that information is available, and you need and should ask the question. And this is failing to amend valuation once provided with a QS or building surveyor. Sometimes, all due respect to Jim, it might be appropriate that a building surveyor undertakes the monitoring role. My own view is early liaison between the valuer and the building surveyor is essential. We're looking at sort of amending terms of business we are amending our terms of business with some of our larger clients to make it a condition. If you take the valuation instruction, you're prepared to revisit your valuation if within a reasonable time scale the bank come back with the stage 1 report. So it's giving you the opportunity to revisit your valuation before the dreaded lend, to avoid a potential problem for both the lender and the valuer in the future. And again, my final one is, if you haven't got the information and you've assumed something, flag it and say so, because we all know that in the initial valuation report you've got a limited time to undertake that. So that's maybe the common problems. We are going to come up with some top tips after this. Just moving on. So I'm here with top tips 1. Repeat again. Don't try and be helpful. Desktops are something that concern me and have caused me some worry in the past. You've been asked to provide a desktop view on the suitability of a site for a development, and you kind of work a desktop appraisal based on limited inquiries, and you come up with something, and then you get the formal instruction. Now, if it's panel managed, it probably won't come back to you, but somebody else carrying out full due diligence will come up with a particularly different figure. But if you're asked to do it, how difficult it is to backpedal on that preliminary advice that you've given. You said, yeah, it's a great site to develop, it's got to be worth this. You go and do your due diligence and find out all the problems, and you've got to say to the bank, well, it isn't quite what I said because, and psychologically, you're backpedaling, which is difficult. Seeking to liaise with the BSQS early. Something I always say as a top tip, stand back from your valuation, whatever it is. Does it look sensible? Does it ring true? Your experience, does it look right? I've seen cases when I was practiced in the north of England of a block of flats next to a sewage farm. Did you stand back? It might look right for the comparables, but it's right next to a sewage farm. Does that look sensible? Adhere to the requirements of the terms of business. As a panel manager, our role is to protect the banks, yes, but also to protect you guys with the fixed terms of business under which you're preparing your advice. And it's in the guidance notes. Produce those sensitivity tests in your development valuations. Refer to them. Make it quite clear how big little changes to the inputs into your residual can have a disproportionate effect. So those are my top tips. And now on to Jim for his.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, what we generally see, a lot of the problems come around because the developer proposals have not been sufficiently developed. If he's coming forward with concept designs, as we've discussed, as the design develops, you can then put some firm costs to it. The more detail on the drawings, the more accurate the costs are going to be, and fewer surprises once the project gets to site. Doing your homework is undertaking, due diligence into the site itself. What do we know about ground conditions prior to commencement? By doing your due diligence onto the site, you can find out a lot more, which is hopefully going to save you some problems once it's on site. Choosing a suitably qualified and experienced professional team, including the contractor. So clearly, if you've got a particular design that you want to use, and there are particular architects and engineers that specialise in that, obviously you want to be choosing that team. And likewise the contractor, if there's something particularly abnormal about the project, you don't want to be choosing a contractor that's just got no experience in this particular area. And lastly, appointing a building contract under a well thought through building contract with all the supporting documents is clearly going to save problems in the long run. So they're my tips.
So my top tips, coming back to the themes concerning contracts and professional indemnity insurance. The first one is to make sure that you have proportionate terms in your contracts, that you're not over-promising, and that therefore your obligations are being sensibly backed by your professional indemnity insurance. As Charlie was touching on, if you do have developments in your engagement, you're being asked to do additional services that you weren't originally being asked to do, it's well worth retrenching your engagement, either by having a separate engagement for those separate services, or perhaps by reissuing your letter of engagement or contract so that effectively you've re-established the boundaries of what you are doing, and as we keep saying, just as importantly, what you're not doing. In terms of your subcontractors, make sure that you have clear written contracts, back-to-back contracts with your subcontractors. Make sure that they've got adequate PI and that they're maintaining it for long enough. In terms of how long is long enough, there's quite a lot of focus on the primary limitation periods of 6 years and 12 years, but it's well worth remembering that for a hidden defect, a claimant has 3 years from date of knowledge to bring a claim, subject to an overall long stop of 15 years. So if in your contracts you don't have a limitation of liability clause that says no claims against me 12 years after practical completion, you're potentially on the hook for 15 years. Hence you may be wanting to look at your subcontractors similarly. They may need to be carrying PI for that long. And finally, very much a PI truism, you can't get an insurance broker in the room without them saying this. Absolutely important to create a file, maintain a file, and make sure that you actually keep it, that you don't archive it too soon. Doesn't go through the shredder. It comes back to that point I just made. It could be as long as 15 years, so you don't want to be shredding your project file after 6 or 12 years. As Charlie was explaining, that contemporaneous evidence can be absolutely critical in defending a claim. A corollary to that in today's environment, bearing in mind how much information is now electronic, how many projects are being run with a common data environment, do consider what would happen if there was a claim against you and you were actually locked out of a common data environment. What does that do to your file? Do you actually have backup copies of that information? Or would it be the case that actually the claimant has now got control over your file in effect, and they may have locked you out for tactical reasons?
Okay. I've talked at length about the importance of setting your instructions out clearly in writing, the fact that your scope of your duty may change with time. Send another engagement letter. Attention to detail, again very obvious, but the number of claims we see where just the bits of a report where that are taken from your say notes at a site visit and mistakes are made. It's that transposing of data. Attention to detail is just something that again a lot of the mistakes we see stem just from silly mistakes. Sticking to your area of expertise. Of a valuer valuing development sites, large and small, farms, pubs, B&Bs, resi, from Swansea to Cambridge. I know him well because those are just examples of all the claims that I had to help him out with. So again, stick to your area of expertise. No client's ever going to mind you saying, actually, do you know what? John's more of an expert on this than me. I'll have a word with John. We'll come back to you. It saves that embarrassment, saves that PI claim. Email. I think I said earlier, if you're facing a claim, your whole file becomes disclosable. And people are getting better, but I have seen many occasions emails that have some work-related stuff, but there's a bit of banter in there. That banter may be the sort of banter that you don't want on your file, you don't want to disclose, but as part of the fact that all electronic documents would have to be disclosed, you can't stop that being sent to your client. So think very carefully. If you wouldn't want that email read out before a court, send 2 emails. Send your banter separately, send your work email. Jim's talked about the importance of good files, contemporaneous records. I've given a couple of examples of how we've managed to get rid of cases where we had contemporaneous evidence. It is key. It's key not only to persuading a court that you've got a good case, it's also key to persuading your insurers to fund your defence. Because if you can't get a defence off the ground, you're in a really sticky position from the word go. So it's all very well me sort of sitting here saying, oh yes, well I would like to see. Actually, there's a lot of good stuff in there that you know you should be doing it. We all know we should be doing it. We're all busy, but there's certain things, you know, those difficult conversations, the things that need to be recorded and should go down in the file. Having put together a good file, as Jim said, retain it. Do not lose it. That's me. John.
Thanks, Charlie. Is it just?
Yeah.
Okay, afternoon or just stroke evening, guys. I'm aware that we're sort of teetering on the timescales, so I'm just going to chat to you about the current state of the professional indemnity insurance market. I'd love to tell you we've saved the best till last, but I think after what you hear what I've got to say, you might argue that point with me. Unfortunately, the current state of the professional indemnity insurance market is that we are in a hardened market space. So what does that term mean? What is a hard market and how have we got there? A lot of people are perhaps unaware of the makeup of insurance and the insurance market as a whole. You have a variety of different providers of insurance. Brokers can access Lloyd's of London syndicates, composite insurers or managing general agents, MGAs, to provide quotations, generally speaking. And it's Lloyd's of London where the central point of the hardening of the market has occurred. In 2016 and 17, they had their two worst years on record for claims. A lot of that was to do with global macroeconomic factors, things like natural disasters, the Californian wildfires. These sorts of occurrences have led to major claims being paid out of the Lloyd's of London marketplace. If we go into the microeconomic climate of just the UK, professional indemnity insurance has been found to be the second worst performing class of insurance. And this, along with the macroeconomic environment, has led to a review of Lloyd's, which was taken place in the summer of 2018. The review was put upon on every syndicate to analyse their distribution, so how an insured such as yourselves get a quotation, where it comes from, what those distribution channels, and also how they're going about coming up with their quotations and prices that are going out to insureds. That led to a number of syndicates being forced to close. Now, I've only been working in insurance in 10 years, but in that time I'd only seen one syndicate close. There has now been 9 since July 2018 when this review was taken. Alongside that has been the importance put upon these syndicates of what class of insurance they can write and then how they go about writing that insurance as well. So what we're finding and what we have found is that there are a number of insurers which have now got restrictions upon being even allowed to write professional indemnity. If they are allowed to do so, then they need to have certain parameters around how they come up with a price or policy. So hard market effectively means that we have less selection of insurers available, is the first starting point of that. Either insurers have pulled out of the marketplace or have shut down due to poor performance. That narrowing of insurers creates a couple of problems for us. In a softer market, more choice means cheaper premiums and broader policy coverage. It means more open views on claims history or experiences of the company and a more perhaps less thorough approach to providing a quotation. In the hardened marketplace, you can get hit by the double whammy of premiums going up and then coverage also being narrowed, which we're seeing a lot of, but also insurers being far more thorough in their approach to providing a quotation. Even for the largest multidisciplinary practices in the UK, you would be able to go through a clear process of getting a quotation 24 months ago. All of these quotation processes are taking 5-10 times longer than they were previously. You're having to go back to insurers on a number of occasions to talk about the same business and the same entity, which we didn't experience in the softer market conditions. There have been, so I've mentioned a couple of these already. There have been PI market defining losses. This I can coin a current phrase where professional indemnity is an insurance paid by the many but for the few. So they are impacted, and if you are impacted and affected in the marketplace by large losses at a scale that are perhaps not even in your zone. So one of the PI market defining losses has been an accountancy practice that has cost the insurance market circa £2 billion over one claim and circumstances that have risen out of that claim. Now what that does is put the spotlight onto professional indemnity, and again it puts us in this change of underwriting strategy and disciplines. Okay, let's step away from professional indemnity for X number of years until the market calms down, and that's something that we're seeing quite regularly across the marketplace currently. So, what can we do, and is it all doom and gloom? No, it's not all doom and gloom. There are certainly still insurers in the marketplace available to provide quotations for you. What you do need to do is look into a couple of factors. Firstly, is your insurer going to be available to provide a quotation? Now, you might be, in your eyes, the most perfectly run practice in the nation. You might not have ever had a claim, but that doesn't mean that your current insurer will actually be available to provide a renewal quote. As I say, it's for the many, not the few style process of claims, and that's likewise for their approach to renewing risk. So we're finding that even if you have an impeccable claim record, your insurer might not actually have the strategy moving forward of doing professional indemnity insurance. So I'd say about 3 months, 4 months out from renewal, you need to be speaking to your broker if they haven't already contacted you to find out whether your existing insurer is still going to actually provide a quote. If they're not, what's the plan? Speak to your broker, find out what their strategy and plan is to actually find you a new insurer. If you've got any claims at all, insurers need no encouragement whatsoever to either say no or put premiums up. So you're going to have a pretty robust application that goes out to the insurers. So you need to work with your broker to provide an in-depth analysis of all of your claim circumstances, particularly those that have either paid or have cost reserves of over £50,000. If that is the case, you'll need to go through those files and provide pretty robust details of what happened, what procedures you may have put in place to prevent that happening again, and any remedial action you've done with that client, how it's affected your relationship with that client, and those types of things. A good covering letter is a good idea as well. An insurer in many cases will only have the proposal form that you've provided to your broker to go by. That provides a cross-section analysis of certain bits of data like your fee income, your split of work, XYZ that are on everyone's proposal form. But that covering letter can really paint a picture as to who you are, what's your business all about, what's your ideas, what's your strategy, how do you go about recruitment, do you have any growth plans moving forward, do you have plans to actually maybe sell the business in X number of years' time, are you looking at acquisitions, what's your strategy around that, and those sorts of extra bits of storytelling can actually help an underwriter buy into your business before they get to the cut and chase of numbers, percentages, because we are still at the mercy of individual underwriters' viewpoint. That's a lot of what insurance is. It is a risk still, and it's not as straightforward as putting these numbers in and computer says no, as we may imagine it would be, particularly in the Lloyd's marketplace. So there are still insurers having their own sort of creative license to take on a risk that they believe is worth writing. So all of this extra work at the initial stage can really help paint the right picture to insurers. And I'll just finish off by saying that we are finding that professional indemnity premiums across the surveying market are going up. There is no exact figure that I can tell you. I have certainly seen occasions where it's increasing by as much as 400 or 500% on the previous year without any particular worsening of that client's risk from the previous year. it might be that claims that they've had in the past were sort of underwritten by insurers as well. We can ignore that as it was a one-off, and that style of underwriting is now gone, and those claims are being brought back into play again and analysed and looked at in more detail, and it's taking a bit more time. So a very, very good presentation is the most important part that I could suggest to you, and then speaking to your broker about the strategy. And even then, sadly, the market has been turning at such a rate that you could have designed a strategy around getting a quotation with your broker that you feel is bulletproof, but the market's changed, and with a couple of weeks before renewal you might find yourself in a situation that neither of you had potentially predicted. So it is tough, but we are about 14 months in of having been in this hardened market space now, and we're hoping that for the next 12 months and perhaps the further 12 months after that, it's going to be a bit flat before it starts to hopefully soften for the construction and surveying markets. Yeah, it is important to take it seriously is the message that I would give out, and be in good communication with your broker, whomever that may be. If you feel that you may not have the confidence that your broker's taking that proactive approach, then the good news is I'm here for at least another 20 minutes. So you can come and have a chat with me rather than getting out on the road and getting home. You could avoid that rush hour traffic and chat to James or I or Ben. We do have some time for Q&A to any of the panel. I don't know if anybody does have any questions that they would specifically like to ask or aim at anybody in particular, but we are here for questioning, should you wish.
Any questions? Well, that's good news. I hope you've taken away some tips today to sort of avoid the potential scenario of a claim, because I've acted as an expert witness. I've worked for firms that have had claims, and I've seen how it does affect individuals, and I've seen some good surveyors at the end of their careers with professional firms who've had a once in a lifetime claim against them, and it has spoiled their lives. So it's worth remembering that and saying to you, drilling into your teams the importance of trying to get it right. So final chance, if there's no questions, firstly today I'd like to thank all my co-presenters and presenters who put this together. Okay, so thank you and see you downstairs. Thank you.